Islam in terms of how Islam can be lived in secular life. So it's a very, very important issue. So I'm going to go ahead and start with Imam Ghaleb Bencheikh. If Imam Bencheikh, if you could give us a perspective on, we have these two diametrically opposed views on the issue. One view is this is an issue of Islamophobia. And this is another attempt by political powers to frame Muslims and continue imposing a cloud of suspicion on Muslims and trying to control their religion. On the other hand, you have this view that this is a problem of Islamic radicalism that is intolerant, cannot accept free speech, cannot be part of a secular society until it reforms itself. So I know it's a tough question, but if you can navigate us in terms of where these issues play out on the larger issue of the status of Muslims in the West.
Thank you. First of all, I apologize for three things. I'm very sorry to join you very late because I was finishing another video conference, another Zoom. The second thing that I'm not Imam. I'm only Ghaleb Bencheikh. Yes, I'm the president of the Foundation of Islam in France, but our foundation works in the education and culture fields, but I'm not Imam. My father was the former rector of the Big Mosque of Paris, but I'm not Imam. It's important to tell this. The third thing that my English is very defective because in France we don't practice English. I apologize if my ideas are not accurate. You are right. Muslim in France, they are citizens and also resident in France. They find them between two dangers, the Islamic radicalism or the extremism from religions in one side, and the other side, you have the far-right extremism. And after the terrorist attacks, every time we find us to be obliged to say we condemn with energy the terrorism, and we have also to say we need reaction in after the security operation. We need reactions in the political field, and we have also we need also response in the educational and cultural and social issues.
Thank you so much, and no need to apologize for your English. You speak as well, if not better, than most Americans. So thank you so much.
Thank you
for your thoughtful reply. Let's go to Dr. Melyssa Haffaf. We talk about secularism and the need, as Ghaleb Bencheikh was talking about, the need for structural reform, and this issue of can secularism adopt to the needs of religious groups today? Religious movements are growing; they're not going away. And the problem with European secularism, to my understanding, is that, as many people have said, that it is viewed as anti-religion, whereas in the United States, at least in theory, the idea of secularism is to be neutral on religion. So where do we need to go in terms of structural reform as it relates to religion in these Western societies?
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for having me today. I don't know where we should go. I can't just give prescriptive measures in terms of where we should go, but what I can say is that what I've been observing in the past years, especially in the past decades, is that in France, as soon as there is a crisis or an attack, all of a sudden we push the far right agenda. Although the far right hasn't been elected in terms of holding the presidency, we saw that under Hollande with socialist, right, government, and particularly Manuel Valls, his prime minister, who has pushed all kinds of measures of destituting dual citizens if they were caught of acted, where plotting a terrorist attack or being caught for terrorism. And there's always this sort of specific measures that we do towards the Muslim community instead of really looking at the roots of all of these issues, because most of these attacks are being carried out by French citizens. We often talk about Muslims as being somehow outside of that society. And when it comes to national security, I think France is going into making the same mistakes like the United States has made after 9/11. By criminalizing and demonizing the Muslim community, allowing all types of surveillance, attacking the right of consciousness, the right to organize. And in that sense, the reforms we're just going to add more legislations. Basically, Macron early in October made a speech announcing a new bill that will tackle separatism. But what I was really had a lot of issues with is that he always talked about radical Islam without ever defining it. And then we never talk about white supremacist group and neo-Nazi group, who are a real big threat to French society in that sense. So I don't know, with at least what is happening right now, this current government and the past ones, are not really respecting what the universalism is about and what France supposed to be standing for, the motto of liberté, égalité, fraternité, that we've never really respected that. And also we cannot even have these conversations about secularity or laïcité, actually, which is really a sort of a different framing, without looking into history and how has France really actually materialized this laïcité. Under colonialism, Algerian Muslims had a different status. And then we come afterwards, we have Algerians fighting in all of these wars in World War I and World War II, and then getting a different type of veteran compensation. So many ways in which legally France has not been respecting universalism. And now by tackling that, we are hoping to bring another legislations that are going to limit the civil liberties and freedom of Muslim citizens by never really looking at the cause of the issues, because there's a lot of analytical, emotional. Who are these terrorists? Who are the people who are carrying out these attacks? Are we ever talking about mental health? Never. It's always about, okay, now let's send a strong message, whatever that is. And the strong message is always criminalizing the Muslim community. So I'm not sure if I responded to your question, but at least what I see with what the reforms are taking place right now, I think France is probably fooling itself if it thinks it's going to carry out the same counterterrorism measures and hoping for, because clearly it's not working. It's really not working. We keep on having attacks, and yeah.
Well, and definitely, right. And even, in the United States, when there was the 9/11 terrorist attack, all the counterterrorism measures have always been, have just created more problems and have not, I don't think anybody can reasonably say they were successful. So in this instance, I don't think just using counterterrorism measures and then mixing it with the need to change Islam or really encase Islam the way you want to see it, or tame Islam, as they put it, is not going to work. This is going to backfire as well.
I think we have an example, and what is also striking is that every time we talk about national security, Muslims, French Muslims don't seem to be part of that. They actually become the suspects.
Yes.
I don't know how we're going to build from that. And by destroying the few organizations who are doing work on the ground to actually support the needs of Muslims, such as, I mean, we'll probably talk about it, but yeah, that's, as of now, that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you. And then for our audience, you can post your questions either in the chat space, or there's a Q&A icon. You can go ahead and post your questions there, and we will be happy to convey it to our esteemed panelists. I want to go to Yasser Louati now. Yasser, you know, we hear a lot about how Muslims cannot adapt to modernity, and therefore that is why these governments are instituting national security measures, because Muslims can't resolve the problems themselves. And you have, you know, the gruesome attacks in France that resulted in beheadings and killings, shootings. So we can't ignore that as a problem. So if we're going to say that national security is not going to be the way to deal with this problem, what is the alternative?
Thank you, Salam, and thank you for setting up this platform. So first, yes, you will hear a lot about Muslims, but you will not see Muslims speaking for themselves. As we speak today, just take a look at the media landscape in France. It's Muslims day in, day out, and you wouldn't see them. Maybe once a week, someone would be passed by, and then that's it. So it's again white-to-white conversation about people who are either the suspects, the culprits, the enemy, the monster, the terrorists, whatever. So this again raises a question of the representation of Muslims. And when Muslims became political actors, let's say, I'm going to be unfair to historians, but let's say about the 1970s, when they began setting up their own collectives, their own unions, Mouvement des Travailleurs Arabes, or the Movement for Arabian Workers, which split off the main union, the CGT, because they did not take racism, police brutality, and racist crimes seriously. And especially after 1983, when they marched, the famous March for Equality and Against Racism, there was a shockwave throughout the country, because those people are actually here to stay. And on top of it, they are demanding equality. So they are no longer the invisible statistics we hear about, workers' unemployment and productivity. Today, they are marching, and all the way from the south to the capital. So the reaction was a violent backlash. First, a book called L'immigration, le choc by Alain de Griot-Terret, which was actually the ideological backbone that gave legitimacy to problematize Muslim identity in France. So they cannot integrate, they cannot be assimilated, and therefore they should be treated as such. So there was the commission, the Marceau Commission in 1987, and a series of measures. So what we see today is the total incapacity to accept Muslims, I don't know if I should say as human beings, but at least as parts of the French landscape. It also has to do with the way history is taught. Most historians come from the conservative side, and it's always history being taught through the lenses of a white man leading the nation across the ages, a king, an emperor, etc. Yet the minorities that have contributed to free France during the Second World War, for example, to rebuild the country during the 30 glorious years, and the people who are actually part of this country are not spoken of as equal citizens. So this really raises the question how France identifies itself. And if you listen to some conservative pundits on the media, France is a white Christian country, and that Muslims should adapt. And anytime they question the status quo and want to be equal, they are treated as they are asking for privilege. So I heard, for example, that laicity should adapt. I'm completely against it, because the 1905 law is good. It's a separation of state and religion. It means the state does not meddle in clerical affairs, and minority religions are protected from state interference. What we see in the opposite, and I think Melyssa mentioned it, that there was a special status for Algerians during the colonial era, that laïcité was passed in 1905. It was applied in continental France, but never in the Muslim colonies to keep Islam under control. And that's exactly what we're seeing today. So on top of constantly putting them in the box of the other, Muslims, anytime they organize, are immediately perceived as a threat. In a country where nothing was given to the people without mobilization. This country was built on revolutions, on mass movements, on strikes, on banging on the door to demand equality and rights, as women's rights, what the unions did, what the anarchists did, etc. But when Muslims adhere to this, French contestataire, which runs in our DNA as we have to face power and calling it out, that's problematic. So to something, I know we're going to have more questions, but to sum things up, Muslims actually today represent three threats. Threats to the national economy. I would say it is soft, because the next two are threat to the national identity and to national security. And I think Muddassar mentioned, or you, Salam, spoke of France as the canary in the coal mine. Actually, I call France the laboratory of Islamophobia, because when you see the way Islamophobia has been made legitimate by the state, that laws can be passed specifically against a minority. The Minister of Interior called Muslim leaders and said, the other religions should not feel targeted by the adjustments we are making against you, which is blatant. So if France is a laboratory of Islamophobia for Europe and maybe also the rest of the world, China and India are using France as an excuse to crack down on Muslims there. Muslims in France are today the barometer of democracy and the rule of law for France.
Thank you so much, Yasser. Dr. Myriam Francois, you heard what Yasser was talking, and I see you nodding. So if the laws are there, as Yasser cited the 1905 law on separation of state and religion, then what's the problem? What structural reforms or political reforms do we need to be pushing for?
Hi, everyone. Thank you. So yes, absolutely. I agree with Yasser in what he was saying, that actually, I think it's really important to push back against the framing that the French government has put forward of the recent instances of terrorism as somehow being an attack on free speech or secularism. And I'll explain why. When we speak about these terrorist attacks, which targeted, in the first case, a teacher, and the second, a basilica, we are talking about individuals whose deaths are being instrumentalized to forward a particular political agenda. Because actually, Charlie Hebdo and its images were in no way shut down because of these attacks, not the ones in 2015, none of the subsequent ones. In fact, in many ways, you could argue that offensive images to Muslims have become part of the institutions of the French Republic in response to these attacks. So I don't buy the argument at all that free speech has been targeted by these attacks, because what we've seen since then is that these images are now taught in schools to very young children, which is a very questionable pedagogical decision. It's also now being, in the aftermath of the most recent attacks, these images were being broadcast onto municipal buildings. So this is your local municipality, which is now putting up images of Prophet Muhammad naked, in all sorts of poses. If this is free speech shut down, I'd love to see what it actually looks when it's completely free. I'd also push back against this construction of there being a problem with laïcité in France. Muslims do not have a problem with laïcité in France. The most recent and the largest study that's been done by the Center of Conflict in Paris, looking at attitudes among French Muslims to the Republican values, shows that Muslims overall adhere more than the wider community to the institutions of the Republic, apart from two areas. You want to know what they are? The first is the police, okay? And we can come back to that. And the second is the media. And the media, if you have ever watched French media, and I wish somebody would pay me to just translate French evening TV shows, because you would get a sense of how horrifically disgusting the conversations are. We have somebody called Éric Zemmour that I would recommend you look up, who's been twice convicted of hate speech, who is a regular panelist virtually every single night on TV in France. He is called to offer his expertise on issues to do with Muslims. He's been twice convicted of hate speech against the community. So this is not about free speech. This is not about secularism. This is about the scapegoating of a particular community for political ends. We touched on the Le Pen. Melyssa, of course, spoke about the fact that we don't need Le Pen to come to power for her ideas to become mainstream. That's absolutely the case today. The rhetoric that we hear from certain parts of the French government, speaking of culture wars, are reflective of the fact that the far right's priorities have now seeped into the mainstream. And if I could make one final point, I really resist the notion that we are dealing with a problem Muslim community. I think we are in France seeing politicians Islamify social and political problems. Can we first talk about who Muslims are? Muslims in France are predominantly working class Black and Arab communities in ghettoized suburbs, cut off from everything else. Until a few years ago, if you missed the last train into Paris, you were stuck and couldn't get home. This is how isolated some of these centers, which are filled to the brim with buildings that are dilapidated, no jobs, unemployment rates running in the 40%. If you want to look for causes of frustrations, you just have to go into these neighborhoods. You don't have to be Muslim to be frustrated in these neighborhoods. However, you might additionally be frustrated if, in addition to all of these barriers you're encountering, there are then a stigmatization, a continuous discrimination, and a state of exception when it comes to the rule of law, which is being directed specifically at you. You can't go to the beach and wear what you want. There are so many anecdotes I wish I could share. My best friend in Paris is French Algerian. She married a Black Haitian man. Her father disapproved of this, so he called the terrorist hotline. My best friend was placed in house arrest for several weeks. She lost her job because her employer had to be told that she was being investigated for terrorism charges. This is a McCarthyist environment in which people can literally call up a terrorism hotline, denounce somebody with no evidence, and wreck their lives. This is what is happening. This is a state of authoritarianism. This is very little to do with Muslims.
Thank you so much. We go back to Dr. Ghaleb Bencheikh. We understand the problems, and quite frankly, what I hear is the racism, institutionalized racism coming from the top of the government, from both the left and the right. And it's the same in the United States as well. But what is the responsible role then of Muslims in leading on this effort? And while I disagree with the statement that Islam is in a state of crisis, I do believe that Muslims are in a state of crisis. Put aside all the structural political problems we're facing in the West, we still have an identity crisis as Muslims in terms of how Islam tells us to lead in advancing civilization, but we're barely even registering in terms of being in the arena to make an impact. So is there a crisis among Muslims right now? And how can we take a responsible role in leadership in issues such as what has been articulated in terms of institutionalized racism against our communities in France?
Yes, I think that there is multifactorial, big number of parameters to answer for your question. You have a level for social problems, and you have also psychological and theological problems to resolve them. in France. And the big question is also about identity for French Muslim here. And they have not the leaders with the capacity, the aptitude to resolve their problem since 3 decades. The last example is since two days or 3 days, President Macron asked them to obey, in spite of the law of 1905. It's a law of separation between state and church, between state policy and religion. And those leaders of the French Council of Islamic region, they accepted to build a national council of imams. Normally, they haven't to obey to the president in this case exactly. But in the same time, we need here in France to have men and women with the responsibility to say to the Islamic component of the nation, because I don't want to say the Islamic community, because here in France we have the one national community, it's the national one with components. This component or Islamic component in France, in the social lecture, we have 2 parts. A little part, Dr. Myriam Francois, I think that she said they have some social problems, but we have also who buy horses in Deauville, who buy big palaces, big hotels in France. They are Muslim also. They are minority, yes. The others have social problems, and they try to resolve them with a radical religious discourse. And now we try to have the political solution and also a way to explain that the citizenship is the best way to resolve problems here, and we can't only stay in a security situation which is very hard and difficult for all of us.
Thank you, thank you. Dr. Melyssa Haffaf, do you want to respond to that?
Can you remind me and can you reframe? I mean, you want to address, I mean, I don't think that Muslims are in crisis, to be honest. As Dr. Myriam Francois said earlier, do we know the Muslim French community? We never have them. As Yasser was saying earlier, it's been decades and even more intensified in the past 10 years of having every hour of the day a show on TV, on the radio, newspaper articles. And those shows that will have Islam and Islam as a threat and Muslim as a threat will only have white men who know very little about Islam as a theology, but also just the reality of Muslim, which we also tend to conflate a lot. And so you have all of this sort of media and discourse that Muslims are not a part of. And in that sense, when you said in your introductory remarks that we getting those jobs and I think what is happening in the United States, and for living here in Washington, D.C. For a little while now, it's a very different story. And I think the Muslim community in the United States is extremely diverse for many, many reasons. So I don't want to get into sort of talking about the American Muslim community as a monolith, but in terms of where they're situated in terms of socioeconomics, it's a very different story than France. As Dr. Francois was mentioning earlier, we're talking about overlapping discrimination. It's access to education, it's housing, it's employment, and socioeconomic, and then the racism that you face on a daily basis. And France does not keep statistics according to race or religion. In the name of universalism and saying that all French citizens are the same, so we're not going to. But then by doing so, we end up perpetuating this colorblind society that is, yeah, officially it's that, but on a daily basis, what is the reality of Muslim people when it comes to the way they move in French society? And more we've seen, as I said, we normalize, legitimize, mainstreamed far-right rhetoric. And I don't think at this point I don't even know how we're going to be able to work against such a machine that's already so far. And the average French person, the type of things I see on Twitter, all of my Muslim friends were just so blasé and exhausted, if anything, you know, when it comes to trying to fight back when you don't even have the means to do so. And the few times when you have somebody such as Yasser Louati, who's going to say something pertinent on a French TV show, oh, you will never see him again. That is for sure.
No, I think you're right. And
a lot of layers here that we need to deconstruct. I'm sorry, to that, right?
Yeah, I think I think you're right that when we were speaking about, for some Muslims on the granular level, you know, they go to school. If they get a good education, they get a good job, they have good homes. Of course, in the situation of many French Muslims who live, as Dr. Myriam Francois correctly put it poignantly, that, you know, they live in ghettos and they are separated from the rest of society. So yes, I wasn't referring to that situation, but
I just wanted to. I didn't. I was just wanting to say also that we need to also talk about all of these other factors that a lot of times are missing from conversations, and we're talking about an already sort of fragile and vulnerable community. So it's so easy to be, you know, beating on a dead horse in that sense. And there's not a lot for the communities to be resisting, considering the ways, the state of affairs.
Correct. Thank you. Back to Yasser. Yasser, there was a question that is presented that, you know, could we be talking about the issue of France, that the problem facing Islam today in you know, throughout Europe and even to some extent the United States, that there's the presence of what this person called Salafists, or in a more you know, instead of labeling it, but describing it, that there's that rigidity within our religious leadership that is also exacerbating the problem, or is part of the problem. You're muted.
Actually, this term Salafism is extremely, how can I say, dangerous to use, because it is thrown out in the public debate. I'm called a Salafi, and then I'm even called, you too, yeah, even Myriam is called a Salafi, and or Muslim Brotherhood Salafi, and I mean, like, you know, people don't know what they're talking about. And like in any community, you will always have a conservative fringe that wants to abide by, you know, strict, and as you said, you know, rigid rules, but they are by far not the majority. I mean, like, you know, we don't see them as being, you know, the leaders of Muslim communities all over. They exist as a human rights. I think they have the right to exist, to express their opinions. They can't impose them upon others, but they have the right to exist. The same way we have extremely conservative Jews in Brooklyn, in Paris, go to the 19th arrondissement of Paris, where I used to live, you would see like extremely radical Jews from North Africa, and they literally live like in a parallel society. So, and they have the right, I mean, as long as they don't like, break any rules. But when it comes to Muslims, we put that as, okay, we're going to take these and make them as, the illustration of why Muslims are a problem. I think there is a deep problem in France with the idea. France historically hated strong identities. It did not like, a strong, it had identity from Brittany, Bretagne, or for example, people in the central France or the Basque, etc. It does not like strong identities. And even after the French Revolution, people in the Southwest, in Vendée, were massacred, to say the least. And we see that multiple communities faced it. But what's dangerous today is that the same mechanisms that have led to the near extermination of Jews in the 1940s are today being copied, and we see the same thing happening again and again. We go from the criticism towards a religion, which is legitimate, to the demonization of the people who practice that religion. Nevertheless, there are indeed problems in terms of the way Muslims are organized. There are influences that that are using Muslims as, how can I say, political raw material. So you will have foreign countries, I will name them, Algeria, Morocco, Turkey, etc. They will use some communities as an extension of their foreign policy. And that's why there is a bitter ongoing war between Algeria and Morocco to take control of mosques in France. Any organization in France that deals with, managing a mosque, etc., they have to pledge allegiance to either Morocco and Algerian. And of course, this is used through the origin of the people in there, in the board. On top of it, we see the interference of the state, the mayor, the prefect, the minister, etc. And Emmanuel Macron wants to make that legal because it is done today, but it's illegal because it goes against laicité. So the people who have a problem with the secular law are the people from the government because they want to have a backdoor for the law on laicity. Okay, we can intervene and nominate who's going to be the right Muslim representative. So again, this calls against for a better organizing of Muslim communities to gain their independence, not only from the countries back home, but also towards the French state. And this actually, requires the capacity for Muslims to speak to one another instead of speaking to each other through the state or through the consulate of Morocco or Algeria. The organization, for example, that Emmanuel Macron is using as his go-to people for the Muslim community, the CFCM, the French Council of the Muslim Faith. It was set up in 2003 by Nicolas Sarkozy, in a brutal violation of laicity. A minister cannot set up an Islamic organization or Jewish or Catholic. He set that up. That organization is not known to have held, not once, free and transparent elections, never had a Muslim at its Muslim women at its board, let alone at its head, and it is not representative of the diversity of the various Muslim communities, origin, gender, social class, women, etc. So today, again, if I'm not going to say Muslims I don't think Muslims are in crisis. I think France has, Western countries have a problem, an identity problem when they see those Muslims rising and say, we are part of this country, we are part of the national narrative. And when we hear we feel we belong in that we. But the problem is now for Muslims to kind of take the matter into their own hands. And I know this might be unpopular towards the government. And I was, summoned, to keep quiet on these issues. I won't. But Muslims are supposed to take the matters into their own hands, manage their own mosques. So it represents the local community and it serves the interests of the local community, that diversity is represented, and that the umbilical cord with the countries of the home countries is cut off. Because again, we don't see the countries back home standing against Islamophobia. I don't see Morocco or Algeria speaking up against the daily Islamophobia faced by Muslims. I'm just going to take one extra minute just to explain the depth or illustrate how Islamophobia is literally a killer in France. Immigrants in France, mostly from the former colonies, are 3 times more likely of being unemployed. If you are a Muslim person in France, you apply for a job, you have to apply 5 times more If you are a Muslim woman with a headscarf, you stand a 1% chance of getting a job. 1% chance of getting a job. And the only jobs are self-employed nannies for the most of the time. And they are trying to ban that for Muslim women. In terms of housing, you are 3 times more likely of waiting over a year, 38 times to wait more than a year. So this is not only a social apartheid for the Muslim majority, but also a social death sentence for many Muslim women. So I forgot who spoke about this first. I think it was Dr. Melyssa Haffaf on terrorism. This raises the question, how come foreign-based terrorist organizations can use France's social problems to hire from within France? And France, which is home to the biggest Muslim minority in the West, and on top of it has passed the greatest number of laws specifically targeting Muslims. So yes, now I think a better organizing of Muslims is overdue, long overdue, but I think there will be more clashes if Muslims stand on their own and tell the state, back off, we will manage our own affairs and designate or choose our leaders, but there will also be a fierce backlash by the countries who want to keep messages under control.
Dr. Myriam Francois, there's a question about the French Minister of Education accusing Islamo-leftism of spreading in universities. What is he talking about, and what are its repercussions?
Well, so yes, that's a reference to academics who indeed were corroborating through their research the realities of Muslim lives and of inequality and discrimination and Islamophobia. And those people, in order to be discredited, were tarred with the term Islamo-gauchiste, which is Islamo-leftist, but is very reminiscent of the term Judeo-Bolshevik, if you also remember the convenient use of that term to discredit Jews during a particular period in history, or those who supported the Jewish community. So yes, we have a multi-pronged, I would say, authoritarian response by the government to try and discredit anyone who points out the inequalities that are being experienced and the unjust targeting of Muslims by the government. The academic community, through this particular reference, but also through the fact that now a law has been proposed that suggests that any research will have to be in conformity with Republican values. I would hope that any American who stands by his name would be outraged that an academic community would have limitations placed on what they can and can't research based on what the state defines to be acceptable values. In journalism, we have seen particularly foreign journalists who've written pieces, but also a French-Iranian scholar who'd written pieces that were critical of the government. Those pieces taken down after President Macron had contacted these publications, and those articles are suddenly replaced by op-eds by the man himself. There is a multi-pronged attempt to try and control the narrative around what is happening in France. And on that note, I just want to point out two things. One, when President Macron said he was going to give his speech on les séparatismes, which was plural, the separatisms, the journalists in attendance that day were expecting a speech on various forms of separatism that are challenging French society. Many of them were shocked that it was just Muslims that were targeted in that particular speech. Secondly, I would like to really push back against this idea that Islam is the root cause of the terrorist attacks that we're seeing in France and the major threat facing the French nation. Terrorism is horrific. I have friends personally connected to who have been victims in some of these attacks. The reality is that 260 people have died in terrorist attacks since 2012 in France. 260 since 2012. Over 3,000 people die a year in road accidents. Can we put things into perspective a little bit in terms of the amount of state energy being directed to the idea that there is a really violent and dangerous threat by an entire community? Firstly, let's put it into perspective in terms of the multiple threats that French citizens face, including COVID, but we can post that one for a minute. The idea that Islam and the wider Muslim community is the problem is not corroborated by any facts that I can find. The two most recent attackers, one was a Chechen refugee who was completely disconnected from his community. The local mosque said they had never met him, didn't know anything about him. And the second guy was a Tunisian immigrant who'd been in France for 2 weeks. When you look at the profiles of other people in other attacks, yes, there were French young men and some women who were raised and born in France. However, were they religious, participants in their community who suddenly one day flipped from being, an integral part of the Muslim community to joining ISIS? No, these tended to be people who had no religious background, who actually oftentimes knew nothing about Islam, and then suddenly were indoctrinated by a sect, a cult. Now, the idea that we as Muslims outside of France or in France would accept the official narrative that this is a problem with Islam, with the wider Muslim community, show me the money. Where is the evidence of this? Otherwise, you're just chastising an entire community on grounds that you claim that there is a continuity between the terrorists and the wider community. How? Based on what? We have seen no evidence of this. So we must reject this. This is not a question of, in my opinion, to do with Islam in France. Although I would agree that we have a problem of leadership. I would like to point out that whatever your thoughts on Professor Tariq Ramadan, that until very recently, he was one of the only people that was able to come onto French television and hold his own. It's interesting that he is now, obviously because of personal issues that he's been involved in, completely absent from these forums, which is very convenient for certain people. And I say this as a woman who actually did a report on, the Me Too affair that he was engaged in. But let's be straight here. There is no one left. Rokhaya Diallo is one of the few people who goes on, and she was recently on French television trying very calmly to discuss the issues around Charlie Hebdo, and she was accused live on air by a very senior literary figure, very senior figure in the French, elite circles, of being complicit in the murder of the people at Charlie Hebdo, because she felt that you could both condemn the publication of those images and condemn terrorism. In France today, that is a line that pushes you into the camp of the terrorists. So that tells you where the line is.
Thank you. Well, we're out of time, but I just want to give each of you a minute. Unfortunately, we only have a minute for each of you to give last remarks. Many people are asking, about dialogue. Could the likes of Valentine de Saint-Point serve as a source for real dialogue and discussion between French Muslims and French non-Muslims? Others are asking about still the issue of control of Islamic institutions by members of the Muslim Brotherhood. Some people are asking about, can we provide a beautiful alternative to what these terrorists are doing? So, again, understanding the problems of racism, bigotry, exploitation of religion by these political figures, there's still a lot of questions in terms of, well, what can we do? So if you could just give us your last thoughts, Dr. Bencheikh.
Yes, I think that we have a serious problem with vocabulary or semantic issues. When you say, when you have words with Islamo in the beginning, Islamofascism, Islamo-Nazism, Islamo-Gauchism or Islamo-lifting, Islamo-Rakai, Islamo-Banditism, Islamo-Identitarism, Islamo-Nationalism, we don't accept this. So the French Minister of Education, Jean-Michel Blanquer, is wrong when he speaks about Islamo-lifting or Islamo-Gauchism. Now he tries to speak about Islamismo-Gauchism, but I'm not sure it's a good idea. You have also about Islamophobia. We have here in France the only country in the world where the Islamophobia put problems. because they say that when we want to criticize the religion of Islam, you say that we are Islamophobic. So we are thinking about another word, which is mis-Islami, like misanthropy or misogyny, here in France, because the prefix misos from Greek is the hate, the hatred, the detestation. I think that we have to resolve, first of all, problems about vocabulary and semantic problems.
Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Haffaf, another question to you. In a France that hates strong identities, what are the various manifestations of the French Muslim identity, and do any of these identities have more progress in the cause of government or cultural advocacy?
I mean, again, I think, yeah, it does have clearly issues with stronger sort of subgroups, but this is the whole issue with France, and I think in a lot of places when you talk about diversity, and it's not an opinion to be had. This society is actually composed of these people, and France, with this whole universalism versus multiculturalism, which what we would see in other places, it's still happening. People are here; they're not going to go anywhere. We've been here for generations. In my case, my grandfather fought in World War I and ended up coming back to build France, and then brought his wife, and they had children, and we are the 5th generation. Until what point we are going to not, and our Islam was never incompatible with the République when it was about using us to fight in wars or to do all the work that needed to be done. So at this point, in that sense, I think we should be proud of our heritage. I really want to push back actually against that sort of color blindness, trying to erase our cultures. I mean, and I think it's rich. It's absolutely rich to be coming from all these perspectives, have these languages, have these ways of looking at the world. And if anything, I think most Muslim people in France, most Muslim French, share the same experience of Islam as I do in terms of what it means to us and the values that it pushes. And all we do is hear all of these things that are so foreign. If anything, all of that sort of public discourse is a lot of times completely disconnected. So in that sense, I do believe that we can be, actually just having even the question of this sort of compatibility is problematic, because we've been here, we're French, there's nothing about it you can do. And yes, we come, and what does it mean? It means that French people can only come in one. It's factually, historically wrong on so many levels. There's presence of Islam in France for over 1,000 years. And here we are acting as if we just got here yesterday. So no, I'm very proud to be French, and with all my Islam and all of the different layers to my identity. And I think we should strive to be more organized, have our voices heard. And in that sense, as I said, the problem is that now we're going to have to fight even harder, because there will be new legislations that are actually going to make it legal to reduce our individual rights and freedoms. So in that sense, I think, yeah, there is, as Yasser was saying, we've been organized. This is the country that's what we do. That's what the whole sort of ethos of France is about, resistance. And here you're telling me I'm supposed to, it doesn't make sense. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And Yasser, Louati, if you could also direct us or help us in terms of this question of dialogue. With whom should we be dialoguing? How can we raise awareness, understanding that there's this exclusion in the media where Muslims are not speaking for themselves? You're still on mute. See, you don't want to exclude yourself, Mr. Louati.
Well, I think I'm gonna turn my criticism towards you, American Muslims, is that in 2017, I went all the way to the US to kind of try to connect the dots. And having been myself in school in Fort Worth, Texas, I knew that Americans, even Muslims themselves, tend to think that the world ends at the East and the West Coast, that there is nothing beyond. Now you see that everything that's happening in France ends up being picked up somehow in the US, the narrative, the way it's constructed, and we see the opposite thing happening. So, the concept of taqiyya being used in France, it actually came from the US. The neocons were using against you guys in the US. And I think I'm a firm believer in dialogue and interreligious dialogue, etc. But I think Muslims should speak to themselves. And I think there aren't enough platforms, safe spaces to agree and disagree, allow a free flow of ideas. And that honestly, I don't see many places where Muslims can, yes, agree, but also disagree and say, okay, this is where we disagree, we leave it there. And there's a lot more that we agree on. And before speaking about, dialogue with, other religions, which I'm all for, from the grassroots, not those events, we take pictures, eat couscous and go home. No, I'm talking about real dialogue. So the urgency right now for Muslims is to set up safe platforms to meet and share their concerns, get some support, and maybe, because through dialogue, there will be a return of experiences. You create human contact that, leads to solidarity. And honestly, I think we need to kind of have a transatlantic look on Islamophobia, because again, we began with the idea that, France is the laboratory of Islamophobia, the coal mine, the canary in the coal mine. And this is where the urgency lies. More dialogue between Muslims and a lot more solidarity to move forward.
Thank you. Dr. Myriam Francois, same question to you. We know we're excluded, and Yasser is correct. I mean, a lot of the anti-Muslim animus originated in the United States. This idea of the clash of civilizations came out of Harvard by Samuel Huntington.
Indeed.
And Islam is a violent religion. Islam is an anti-Western religion. Islam is anti-woman. I mean, a lot of it came probably from some Europeans, but it definitely took hold within the neocon movement. And we're struggling with it to this day. Even though we have a Democratic president, there are still people within the Democratic Party who have anti-Muslim animus. Having said that, and again, to the French situation, we're blocked. We feel that our voices are not heard. Where do we go? How do we get our voices heard? With whom should we engage?
So just at one point, in addition to importing some of that Islamophobia, it is worth pointing out that during the colonial era, when Algeria was considered to be a part of France, if Algerians wanted to apply for French citizenship, if they were Jewish Algerians, of which there was a sizable minority, they could do so as Jewish Algerians. Muslims Algerians had to renounce their religion in order to acquire French citizenship. And I make this point because the idea that Islam is a problem with regards to French identity did not begin with, 2012 or 2015. We have long history. I personally am very against religifying this problem. For me, this is a civil rights issue that has to entail collaborations, of which, by the way, we do have support. And I know outside of France, maybe people don't see this, but we have trade unions, we have other organizations, we have academics, we have student bodies who are coming together, who are denouncing what is happening and standing with Muslims, not as religious, not as a religious community, but as fellow citizens whose rights are being infringed upon. And that is the French way. That is our way. That is the way of the Republican model. And personally, I wouldn't want to change that. If I was going to turn to the Muslim community in France, I would say we need those wealthier elements within our community to fund mosques and Islamic centers that can fuel conversations that allow us to think openly and freely with sophistication about how we want to live as French Muslims. It was a dialogue that Professor Ramadan started with to be a European Muslim. It's one we must continue to this day, but that to me is a separate issue. And we cannot ask, in the UK, we had this problem as well where Imams are paid nothing. They're paid below minimum wage. Sometimes they're imported from Pakistan, sleep above a mosque, and then you want them to come and deliver a progressive lecture about what it means to be a British Muslim. Come on. If you pay peanuts, you get what? Let's be real about this. You want quality imams, you want quality Islamic leadership, you need money. You need people of value to think that it's worthwhile to become an imam, a sheikh, a leader in the community. And you don't just leave this to the people who basically can't do anything else, which is, you know, basically where we're at, in my opinion.
Well, thank you so much. This has been very elucidating, and I think for all of us to get a closer view on the situation for French Muslims. I'm saddened every day when I read about, and I've been reading about the situation since even before 9/11. So definitely, you're all correct that this predated all these other political events and international events. And there is still that colonial mentality, even in the US, towards Islam. So that's something that we have to deconstruct and address and push back against, definitely, and replace it with something better for us and for the rest of society. Because I don't think people want to continue living in fear about a religion. Unfortunately, it is the easiest thing to do, and Islam has been that target and continues to be so. But I think all of you are testimony to the fact that by speaking up and speaking out, we can not only alleviate people's fears, but replace it with something much better. So with that, I want to hand it back to Muddassar, who organized this panel. And thank you so much for this wonderful discussion, Muddassar.
Well, thank you, Salam, and thank you everyone for listening. And thank you to the incredible panelists. I really enjoyed hearing the various bits of analysis that were presented today. I think this conversation needs to continue at some point, obviously not tonight, don't worry, but I do think we need to start exploring potential solutions. And, you know, we talk about the United States, but there was a French Muslim that left a mark on the US, and he had a town named after him. And this particular person not only had a town named after him in France, but he was put on the French presidential ballot, which was a unique feat, and his name was Emir Abdelkader. And I became obsessed with him and how he dealt with Islamophobia that was also very, very bad, to the extent that he was being butchered. I think that there are some interesting lessons from history that I think would be lovely to explore with all of you at some point in the future. And with that thought, I bid you all farewell. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you all. Assalamu alaikum.
Merci à tous. Bonne soirée.
Merci.
Salam.
À bientôt.